welcome to the panel, The Future of Newsrooms After This Pandemic. Here with me is Federica Cherubini. She's Head of Leadership Development in Reuters Institute and also author of Changing Newsrooms 2020, Addressing Diversity and Nurturing Talent at a Time of Unprecedented Change. So thank you, Federica, for being part of this Congress.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
This pandemic has changed the world completely. And for journalists, it has been an extra challenge because we have to be informing at the same time that everything is going on. So, Federica, I wanted to know, what do you think was the biggest learning from this pandemic in the world of journalism?
Well, many, for sure. But I think starting from what you mentioned, journalists were part of the story. They were affected by the same fears and limitation and changes in life that everyone else, and the story they were reporting on was a story they were part on. And I think this, from a practical, personal perspective, really changed and helped sort of creating that connection with the audience and understanding of what were the audience, the needs for the audience, what people were interested on, what was the confusion. They were part of the story. So in a way, it was maybe easier for everyone to connect right away on what was the most important to tell, and sort of like avoiding what might happen in other situations and in other topics where maybe if you are a beat reporter and covering politics, you're so much into the story that you kind of maybe forget that your audience doesn't know as much as you. In this case, that the pandemic has democratized, in a way, if you want, how journalists were affected by this story. This is more from a personal perspective, from the journalist reporting. From a newsroom perspective, everyone had to start in the majority of country around the world to work from home. We moved entire operations from a physical setup to an online digital ones. Those companies who were more prepared to do that, for those was easier. Others had huge challenges. Of course, this was possible in different ways. If you're a TV broadcasting company, you would need a studio. But we started seeing, photos and footages coming from people recording in the closet, or like just creating radio shows from the living room. And that's, of course, even from just like a operational point of view, a very big challenge.
Yes, and what was amazing was that we were finding out at the same time, like getting to know information at the same time that we were reporting. So that's really a challenge. So what do you think from this newsroom, from going to remote working? What do you think are the benefits and downfalls from working remotely as journalists?
So as you mentioned, we've done, the Reuters Institute did a survey between September and October last year, asking a selection of newsroom leaders from across the world how they were living through this new situation. What were they thinking of? What was going to be the biggest challenge? I think as part of the survey, we understood that while many felt that the remote working was making them more efficient, no time lost in commuting. No extra cost in commuting, no extra time, much more efficient being in front of the laptop. It really had an impact on the human aspect of social interaction, on the sort of like spontaneous conversation that happens in newsroom, the sort of like creative brainstorming. So many of the challenges that newsroom leaders participate in our survey and our Changing Newsroom report highlighted this challenge of first really thinking about how to make sure that you can engage your entire staff in the same way. Some people might be much more extrovert and forward and being okay and speaking on a video. So how to make sure in a context where you have like a staff meeting on video call, that you make sure that everyone is participating. You losing all of the sort of like clues that you would have in a normal like physical space where you can see if someone is not really engaging. All of that required a much more like proactive effort for managers to make sure that everyone on their team was okay. Working from home people have different living condition, and so to sort of like avoid creating a disparity between maybe more senior staff who have bigger houses and office space, where more junior people maybe share apartment with other people, or on the other hand live on their own. So it was really a big effort to thinking about the mental health of the staff and what kind of impact all of this situation was having on people, and making sure that there was handled carefully and with the right response.
Yeah, and during this time, as you mentioned, many people were working from home, and not all the companies have the same resources. So in your investigation, you were talking about that bigger companies had the chance to give more technology to their employees, have all these access. So what's your advice for companies that aren't that big and that need to give those resources to their employees, maybe using their personal computers or whatever, but regulation doesn't exist right now for remote working. So what do you think are the regulations we need in order for working home, like for instance, for the company to pay the internet or technology wise?
It's difficult to talk about like compulsory regulation, and also this might be so different in so many different countries around the world. And so of course, for example, you mentioned, we start from the assumption that everyone has access to internet and can work from home on their laptop. What if staff don't have internet at home? So, I think the first assessment from a newsroom is to kind of figure out what are the basic needs that the newsroom and the journalists have to do their job effectively, safely. So of course, many were working from home, but reporters on the ground haven't stopped doing their job. So very important thinking about how people can do their job safely if they have to report from a COVID hospital or like from on the street. So first I would say an assessment of what is needed, the basic minimum that is needed to do the job, and how can we provide it. And then really thinking like, maybe doing surveys with their employees if you want to allow people to tell anonymously what would they be their needs, if having an in-person conversation is maybe more difficult in some situations, but really sort of like putting themselves in the shoes of the staff and trying to think, of course you cannot cater for every single individual requirement, but like what can we make sure we do to give the best possible working situation is of course the first step.
Yeah, for sure. And some companies even took their PCs from the newsroom to their homes. So that's amazing. Another important thing that you mentioned was communication. So a great part of going to work remotely is you don't have the same like hand in hand or talking to someone in their daily lives. So what are the outtakes of the research that you made about communication, and what are the advices to have a better one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are almost two parts of the answer to that. The first one was what we learned at the beginning, where everyone all of a sudden was remote. Much more reliance on tools like Slack, Zoom, and on digital tools that made easier for everyone to be up to date at the same time. One important thing that emerged is also like the awareness that every single member of staff receives the same information. So to make sure there is no confusion and that there is no assumption that, people will know. And so maybe creating documents that summarize, rethinking about workflows, and, like many situations, the workflow and the communication was such a big part of workflows was shouted from one desk to the other across the newsroom. How do we replicate that? And I think in a way it's also like, what can we make better? So many, some respondents in the survey also highlighted how the pandemic and this sort of forced innovation really helped some companies that were trying to push a digital transformation much faster, because there was no other option. And so some of the changes that were only thought impossible a few years ago had to happen. You would see big papers, still putting together the print edition from, with 2 people in the newsroom. So really the sort of like aspect on cultural change and how much the pandemic just forced us to do with what we had. But in aspect of the communication is rethinking the tools, also making sure that there is no repetition. So one thing is, the fear of people not getting the right information, but also something, and maybe we have experienced everyone, over communication, and at some point you have a message coming through WhatsApp and a message coming through email, and then something is on Slack. So really thinking about how do we make sure that the process is streamlined, that the tools that we decide to use are the same for everyone. Everyone knows where to find an email, what to find an email, what to find on Slack, what to find on a Google Doc, whatever the tools you're using. So really thinking carefully about that aspect of the communication.
And as leaders, the management teams, what's a more effective way to communicate to the people you're managing without being in person? Because sometimes it's like so different. I know it's part of the same question, but it's so different. Like if you don't see each other, because there's so many companies that they don't even do the Zoom, like seeing each other like we're doing it right now. They just do phone calls, and that takes so much of the like human part of it. So what advice or what's the takeout of that part?
Different answers to this, because there are so many different scenarios. From one end of the spectrum, we are completely Zoom out. You spend day to day and back to back in a video call, and so maybe there is the time where actually just picking up the phone so that people can go for a walk while having a meeting can also be, from very good for the mental health. And so being conscious on how much we're asking of people, but at the same time, as you said, video allows us to see my reaction, to have a feeling, if you have, especially if you're a manager and you have more junior staff, to really get a sense of how people are doing. And are they doing well enough? Do they need any extra support? So like spotting that sort of like aspect on who's struggling in the newsroom was of course much more difficult. And in a sense, for managers, this has also been really demanding, because it also has increased the time that they had to spend in one-on-one, in check-ins, and that is in some cases could be felt a bit of like as a something that took out some extra time to do the job, quote unquote, and to do the editing, to do the reporting. But I think it's important for newsroom managers to realize that a lot of the job as a manager is to take care of people. And so even if sometimes you do feel you're spending the majority of your day in one-on-ones with your staff,
meeting over meeting,
but that might be what is needed. So I like to say a much more intentional leadership we've seen being needed, and we've seen emerge in newsroom where a lot of the things were really rethought about what is the priority and how can I address this.
Perfect. And you also mentioned how in such a short time we had to do so many tech changes, because we had to not only learn how to work from home, but also use technology in a different way, and also learn new softwares using Zoom, WebEx, or whatever the company works with. Which were those changes that you see that were predominant in the survey, and how do you think those changes will help us in the future? So, for instance, using WebEx helps us like not having to go to another country to do a meeting. Instead, you can do it from your home. So, which changes do you?
Yeah, I mean, in the survey, it emerged as, some of these changes will be beneficial, as you said, for example, on the input on climate change, avoiding having to go on a plane to go to a meeting. And so, commuting and those aspects that flexibility allows for people who have caretakers responsibility, whether it's children or older members of family to do that much more flexible. So it increased, of course, the use and the reliance on technology has increased our flexibility. There has been, as we mentioned before, the challenge of making sure that everyone had access to the tech and that the tech was the right one to whatever we were trying to do. And we don't go onto the opposite side of having too many tools and sort of like, really thinking about how do we do training? How do we do mentorship? A lot of the aspect of what happens in the newsroom is like junior staff, junior reporter learning by sitting next to a more experienced reporter, a more experienced editor, and learning their way. So again, much more intentionality, this way of thinking, how do we do training online? What are the tools that we need? Do we need a different platform? Do we need a different, what do we need to make sure that we can do the work that is needed online? And I think, as another aspect is now that some countries are starting to reopening and some people will go in the newsroom, I think the next challenge is sort of like the hybrid newsroom, right? In a way, it was almost, I don't want to say easier, but more straightforward. Everyone was remote, everyone was online. And so while stuff start to go back into the newsroom, maybe it's on a rotation, maybe it's on a few days a week, there are very practical questions in newsroom are facing. Do we bring the staff back as before? Life has changed so much. Do we go back to whatever normal means or meant? What is the new normal? If you allow the staff to sort of like go on rotation and sometimes be at home and sometimes be in the office, how do you make sure that those interactions happen anyway? And concretely, we all been in the old days when everyone was in a meeting room and you were the only person connected to a laptop. You don't hear, like, it's silly things that I'm mentioning, but are very practical ways of challenges for newsroom to think about what does the hybrid newsroom, what is the next year newsroom look like? People might have different expectation now if they've been used to work from home. If they want to continue or not. So even from the survey, even pre-pandemic, not pandemic, pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, from the survey, as I mentioned, we done from September, October, the majority said they were expecting to go back to the office a bit less than before. And again, this was like the first lockdown sort of like wave. So what will be that newsroom and what will be the challenges?
Do you think that's gonna be the norm? Like every company has to have the option of having a hybrid newsroom, or it's depending the company? Because
it will depend a lot on the company.
It's a perk,
a lot of the countries.
Right?
It could be a perk, but it could also be, many newsroom for many stuff. Maybe they had a lot of like free snacks. Like it's silly, but like we'll have to rethink about what are the perks. Is going to the office as a perk or not? And what kind of role does the office play? Do you go back to the office to do the same job as you were doing before? Does the office become a collaborative space? So you go to the office when you have to collaborate and interact with other people, and maybe for doing more like heads down work and writing, you stay at home. What is that sort of balance of, should we rethink about why should someone come into the office? But I think it's going to be very hard to say what everyone will do. And it's going to be, we'll need to see what happens, I think, from the fall, from September, what kind of trends start happening in that.
For sure. And also the way people live right now, just like taking out the commute and also like being home, it's like changed everything, and most people will like to work from home as well. So maybe have the schedule working from home, and then when you're going to air, if it's TV, you go to the place. Or
absolutely.
Something really important about the research you made as well was how young journalists have been affected by this pandemic, right? How we have how recent graduates have less opportunities of being part of the newsroom because there are not so many opportunities of hiring and nurturing the talent. So can you develop a little bit more about that, and what advice can you give to those journalists that are just starting?
Yeah. I mean, of course, we should not forget that the pandemic had a lot of, very serious impact also on the business of news organizations. And so many news organizations had to face cuts or rethinking about, so, in that sense, the investment, for many, it was not a moment of investment on new resources, on training, on doing something extra. And of course, that had an impact. But for those who were in a position to do it and really thinking about what can be changed in a way, the pandemic and the fact that remote work was possible also opened up to different opportunities. So for the junior staff, for example, and for news organization in the past, maybe they were hiring. And the hiring was linked to being able to go work in one of the big cities. I mean, the UK, the big major publication are based in London. The type of person who can maybe afford to be based in London on a junior job was already sort of like self-selecting some of the people who could go for that job. And so we've seen that remote work also opens up opportunity to increase the diversity of the newsroom, also to people from, less advantaged backgrounds and that might not be based in the main cities. So an opportunity there is, of course, to think about who do we hire, where do we hire from, and who gets access to that first selection.
Yeah, for sure. And even hiring people from other countries, that's possible now, because something that you seemed like it wasn't possible before, now with your computer, you can hire someone else. And my last question for you is, what advice can you give to executives or people that are managing the newsrooms? What's the future for them, and what are the challenges they're going to face after everything ends with this pandemic?
I think it's important to mention that, of course, this past year and a half was the year of the pandemic, but it's also been a year of reckoning of lack of diversity in many newsrooms. Prompted in some countries by the discussion around the murder of George Floyd and diversity on race diversity in newsrooms. So for many places, it's been really a year of reckoning of, does our newsroom represent our audience? Does our audience they feel themselves represented in the views, and anyone who selects a view, informs a view, reflects their own experience in a way. And even if you do it impartially, even if you're just like talking about the facts, you bring a view of the world with yourself in the things that you select. And, having that sort of like diversity at the top of the organization helps you having more perspective. And so I think, while executive will be thinking right now on those practicalities of the hybrid newsroom and, how do we go back and in what setting, it's also like, who does our newsroom represent? Are we diverse enough? How we, the sources that we use in our coverage, are those sources diverse enough? And so there is a big part of the report on those diversity. What kind of initiatives do we track data about how diverse is the leadership? And, as we mentioned, while we think about training and making sure that more junior reporters and staff have those opportunities to develop, there is also that aspect of making sure that diversity happens at all levels of the organization, on new staff and like senior management as well.
Thank you very much, Federica. So this is Federica Cherubini, Head of Leadership Development in Reuters Institute and author of Changing Newsroom 2020, Addressing Diversity and Nurturing Talent at a Time of Unprecedented Change. Thank you very much, and I hope everyone could learn about the newsrooms and the future of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you very much.